The empire self-destructs. We share the pathologies of all dying empires, with their mixture of buffoonery, rampant corruption, military fiascos, economic collapse, and savage state repression. Written by Chris Hedges for the Chris Hedges Report, chrishedges.substack.com. Narrated by Eunice Wong. The billionaires, Christian fascists, grifters, psychopaths, imbeciles, narcissists, and deviants who have seized control of Congress, the White House, and the courts are cannibalizing the machinery of state. These self-inflicted wounds, characteristic of all late empires, will cripple and destroy the tentacles of power. And then, like a house of cards, the empire will collapse. Blinded by hubris, unable to fathom the empire's diminishing power, the mandarins in the Trump administration have retreated into a fantasy world where hard and unpleasant facts no longer intrude. They sputter incoherent absurdities while they usurp the Constitution and replace diplomacy, multilateralism, and politics with threats and loyalty oaths. Agencies and departments, created and funded by acts of Congress, are going up in smoke. They are removing government reports and data on climate change and withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. They're pulling out of the World Health Organization. They're sanctioning officials who work at the International Criminal Court, which issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant over war crimes in Gaza. They suggested Canada become the 51st state. They have formed a task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias. They call for the annexation of Greenland and the seizure of the Panama Canal. They propose the construction of luxury resorts on the coast of a depopulated Gaza under U.S. control, which, if it takes place, would bring down the Arab regimes propped up by the U.S. The rulers of all late empires, including the Roman emperors Caligula and Nero, or Charles I, the last Habsburg monarch, are as incoherent as the Mad Hatter, uttering nonsensical remarks, posing unanswerable riddles, and reciting word salads of inanities. They, like Donald Trump, are a reflection of the moral, intellectual, and physical rot that plague a diseased society. I spent 2 years researching and writing about the warped ideologues of those who have now seized power in my book, American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War on America. Read it while you still can. Seriously. These Christian fascists, who define the core ideology of the Trump administration, are unapologetic about their hatred for pluralistic, secular democracies. They seek, as they exhaustively detail in numerous Christian books and documents, such as the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, to deform the judiciary and legislative branches of government, along with the media and academia, into appendages to a Christianized state, led by a divinely anointed leader. They openly admire Nazi apologists such as Russos John Rushdoony, a supporter of eugenics who argues that education and social welfare should be handed over to the churches, and biblical law must replace the secular legal code, and Nazi party theorists such as Carl Schmitt. They're avowed racists, misogynists, and homophobes. They embrace bizarre conspiracy theories, from the white replacement theory to a shadowy monster they call the woke. Suffice it to say, they're not grounded in a reality-based universe. Christian fascists come out of a theocratic sect called Dominionism. This sect teaches that American Christians have been mandated to make America a Christian state and an agent of God. Political and intellectual opponents of this militant biblicalism are condemned as agents of Satan. Under Christian dominion, America will no longer be a sinful and fallen nation, but one in which the Ten Commandments form the basis of our legal system. Creationism and Christian values form the basis of our educational system, and the media and the government proclaim the good news to one and all, I noted in my book. Labor unions, civil rights laws, and public schools will be abolished. Women will be removed from the workforce to stay at home, and all those deemed insufficiently Christian will be denied citizenship. Aside from its proselytizing mandate, the federal government will be reduced to the protection of property rights and homeland security. The Christian fascists and their billionaire funders, I noted, speak in terms and phrases that are familiar and comforting to most Americans, but they no longer use words to mean what they meant in the past. They commit logicide, killing old definitions and replacing them with new ones. Words, including truth, wisdom, death, liberty, life, and love, are deconstructed and assigned diametrically opposed meanings. Life and death, for example, mean life in Christ or death to Christ, a signal of belief, of unbelief. Wisdom refers to the level of commitment and obedience to the doctrine. Liberty is not about freedom, but the liberty that comes from following Jesus Christ and being liberated from the dictates of secularism. Love is twisted to mean an unquestioned obedience to those, such as Trump, who claim to speak and act for God. As the death spiral accelerates, phantom enemies, domestic and foreign, will be blamed for the demise, persecuted and slated for obliteration. Once the wreckage is complete, ensuring the immiseration of the citizenry, a breakdown in public services, and engendering an inchoate rage, only the blunt instrument of state violence will remain. A lot of people will suffer, especially as the climate crisis inflicts, with greater and greater intensity, its lethal retribution. The near collapse of our constitutional system of checks and balances took place long before the arrival of Trump. Trump's return to power represents the death rattle of the Pax Americana. The day is not far off when, like the Roman Senate in 27 BC, Congress will take its last significant vote and surrender power to a dictator. The Democratic Party, whose strategy seems to be to do nothing and hope Trump implodes, have already acquiesced to the inevitable. The question is not whether we go down, but how many millions of innocents we will take with us. Given the industrial violence our empire wields, it could be a lot, especially if those in charge decide to reach for the nukes. The dismantling of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, Elon Musk claims is run by a viper's nest of radical left Marxists who hate America, is an example of how these arsonists are clueless about how empires function. Foreign aid is not benevolent. It's weaponized to maintain primacy over the United Nations and remove governments the empire deems hostile. Those nations in the UN and other multilateral organizations who vote the way the empire demands, who surrender their sovereignty to global corporations and the U.S. military, receive assistance. Those who don't, do not. When the U.S. offered to build the airport in Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince, investigative journalist Matt Kennard reports, it required that Haiti oppose Cuba's admittance into the Organization of American States, which it did. Foreign aid builds infrastructure projects so corporations can operate global sweatshops and extract resources. It funds democracy promotion and judicial reform that thwart the aspirations of political leaders and governments that seek to remain independent from the grip of the empire. USAID, for example, paid for a political party reform project that was designed as a counterweight to the radical movement towards socialism, Movimiento al Socialismo, and sought to prevent socialists like Evo Morales from being elected in Bolivia. It then funded organizations and initiatives, including training programs so Bolivian youth could be taught American business practices once Morales assumed the presidency to weaken his hold on power. Kennard, in his book, The Racket, A Rogue Reporter versus the American Empire, documents how U.S. institutions such as the National Endowment for Democracy, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Inter-American Development Bank, USAID, and the Drug Enforcement Administration work in tandem with the Pentagon and Central Intelligence Agency to subjugate and oppress the global South. Client states that receive aid must break unions, impose austerity measures, keep wages low, and maintain puppet governments. The heavily funded aid programs, designed to bring down Morales, eventually led the Bolivian president to throw USAID out of the country. The lie peddled to the public is that this aid benefits both the needy overseas and us at home. But the inequality these programs facilitate abroad replicates the inequality imposed domestically. The wealth extracted from the global south is not equitably distributed. It ends up in the hands of the billionaire class, often stashed in overseas bank accounts to avoid taxation. Our tax dollars, meanwhile, disproportionately funds the military, which is the iron fist that sustains the system of exploitation. The 30 million Americans who were victims of mass layoffs and deindustrialization lost their jobs to workers in sweatshops overseas. As Kennard notes, both home and abroad, it is a vast transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, globally and domestically. The same people that devise the myths about what we do abroad have also built up a similar ideological system that legitimizes theft at home, theft from the poorest by the richest, he writes. The poor and working people of Harlem have more in common with the poor and working people of Haiti than they do with their elites. But this has to be obscured for the racket to work. Foreign aid maintains sweatshops or special economic zones in countries such as Haiti, where workers toil for pennies an hour and often in unsafe conditions for global corporations. One of the facets of special economic zones and one of the incentives for corporations in the U.S. is that special economic zones have even less regulations than the national state on how you can treat labor and taxes and customs, Kennard told me in an interview. You open these sweatshops in the special economic zones, you pay the workers a pittance, you get all the resources out without having to pay customs or tax. The state in Mexico or Haiti or wherever it is where they're offshoring this production doesn't benefit at all. That's by design. The coffers of the state are always the ones that never get increased. It's the corporations that benefit. These same U.S. institutions and mechanisms of control, Kennard writes in his book, were employed to sabotage the electoral campaign of Jeremy Corbyn, a fierce critic of the U.S. empire, for prime minister in Britain. The U.S. dispersed nearly $72 billion in foreign aid in fiscal year 2023. It funded clean water initiatives, HIV/AIDS treatments, energy security, and anti-corruption work. In 2024, it provided 42% of all humanitarian aid tracked by the United Nations. Humanitarian aid, often described as soft power, is designed to mask the theft of resources in the global south by U.S. corporations, the expansion of the footprint of the U.S. military, the rigid control of foreign governments, the devastation caused by fossil fuel extraction, the systemic abuse of workers in global sweatshops, and the poisoning of child laborers in places like the Congo, where they are used to mine lithium. I doubt Musk and his army of young minions in the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, which isn't an official department within the federal government, have any idea about how the organizations they're destroying work, why they exist, or what it will mean for the demise of American power. The seizure of government personnel records and classified material, the effort to terminate hundreds of millions of dollars worth of government contracts, mostly those which relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, the offers of buyouts to drain the swamp, including a buyout offer to the entire workforce of the Central Intelligence Agency, now temporarily blocked by a judge, the firing of 17 or 18 inspectors general and federal prosecutors, the halting of government funding and grants, sees them cannibalize the Leviathan they worship. They plan to dismantle the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Education, and the U.S. Postal Service, part of the internal machinery of the empire. The more dysfunctional the state becomes, the more it creates a business opportunity for predatory corporations and private equity firms. These billionaires will make a fortune harvesting the remains of the empire. But they are ultimately slaying the beast that created American wealth and power. Once the dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency, something the dismantling of the empire guarantees, the U.S. will be unable to pay for its huge deficits by selling treasury bonds. The American economy will fall into a devastating depression. This will trigger a breakdown of civil society, soaring prices, especially for imported products, stagnant wages, and high unemployment rates. The funding of at least 750 overseas military bases and our bloated military will become impossible to sustain. The empire will instantly contract. it will become a shadow of itself. Hypernationalism, fueled by an inchoate rage and widespread despair, will morph into a hate-filled American fascism. The demise of the United States as the preeminent global power could come far more quickly than anyone imagines, the historian Alfred W. McCoy writes in his book, In the Shadows of the American Century, The Rise and Decline of U.S. Global Power. Despite the aura of omnipotence empires often project, most are surprisingly fragile, lacking the inherent strength of even a modest nation-state. Indeed, a glance at their history should remind us that the greatest of them are susceptible to collapse from diverse causes, with fiscal pressures usually a prime factor. For the better part of 2 centuries, the security and prosperity of the homeland has been the main objective for most stable states, making foreign or imperial adventures an expendable option, usually allocated no more than 5% of the domestic budget. Without the financing that arises almost organically inside a sovereign nation, empires are famously predatory in their relentless hunt for plunder or profit. Witness the Atlantic slave trade, Belgium's rubber lust in the Congo, British India's opium commerce, the Third Reich's rape of Europe, or the Soviet exploitation of Eastern Europe. When revenues shrink or collapse, McCoy points out, empires become brittle. So delicate is their ecology of power that, when things start to go truly wrong, empires regularly unravel with unholy speed. Just a year for Portugal, 2 years for the Soviet Union, 8 years for France, 11 years for the Ottomans, 17 for Great Britain, and, in all likelihood, just 27 years for the United States, counting from the crucial year 2003, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, he writes. The array of tools used for global dominance, wholesale surveillance, the evisceration of civil liberties including due process, torture, militarized police, the massive prison system, militarized drones and satellites, will be employed against a restive and enraged population. The devouring of the carcass of the empire to feed the outsized greed and egos of these scavengers presages a new dark age. That was The Empire Self-Destructs, written by Chris Hedges, narrated by Eunice Wong. For the Chris Hedges Report, chrishedges.substack.com.